that they're the Transition Integrity Project, and it's all about ensuring that there is integrity in the transition project between presidential administrations. And basically, the way they set it up is they basically frame it as it being literally impossible that Trump wins re-election, and that he will lose, and then he will refuse to leave office, and there will be some sort of constitutional crisis. And they claim that they were formed to game out basically how to respond to that imminent crisis. But what's interesting, if you actually look at their document, is that they did 4 different scenarios: an ambiguous result from the election, a clear Biden win, a clear Trump win, and then a narrow Biden win. And what's interesting is that in the clear Trump win scenario, they don't let Trump basically win. Basically, what they do is that they game out how the Biden campaign would do all of this honestly unprecedented, crazy stuff in order to prevent Trump from being inaugurated in January 20th of next year. And those events, if I remember correctly, it starts with basically getting 3 allied governors allied with the, that are, DNC establishment Democrats in a couple of states demanding recounts. And then they send different electors to the Electoral College that will vote for Biden, even though Trump won the Electoral College and won those states, right? Which is like super illegal. But anyway, that's just the beginning. After that, the Biden campaign then says that they won't, they demand certain structural reforms if they're going to, I have to backtrack because there's a bunch of different things that happen. Then they talk to these other governors in California, Oregon, and Washington, right? And the Biden campaign convinces them to secede from the U.S., like leave the country and form their own country, unless Trump and the Republicans agree to a series of structural reforms. And those structural reforms are giving statehood to Washington, D.C., to Puerto Rico, and also dividing California into 5 states. So basically making the country not 50 states, but 56 states, right? And then basically all of those new states, right, are Democrat majority. It ensures like a Democrat supermajority for like any sort of electoral future. It's not really a structural reform, right? And then eliminating the Electoral College, because Clinton had lost that in 2016, but had like won the popular vote or whatever. But it's interesting that in other scenarios where Biden wins the Electoral College, they don't call for the Electoral College's elimination only if Trump wins it, which is, pretty hypocritical. And then, right, so if these demands like weren't enough, right, then basically they broker this event at the next session of Congress in January of next year, where Trump, where they basically agree, the House of Representatives agree to give the presidency to Biden, even though he didn't win. What? Okay, so this group is claiming that they're trying to safeguard U.S. democracy, right, from Trump not leaving office, but they're clearly, those acts are clearly a danger to democracy, or, the public face of democracy anyway, to a much larger extent than Trump refusing to leave the White House, for example, if he clearly loses. What they're doing is essentially, gaming out here is essentially how to undermine a scenario where Trump would clearly, handily, win the election, which obviously would aggravate political tensions that exist in the U.S. to extremes. I mean, Trump supporters would probably, call it a coup, and potentially there could be some sort of armed resistance there. And I mean, it's honestly insane. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's exactly what it is ultimately. But I will get more into my opinions on whether I feel like this is more of a ploy of the 2-party illusion.
Oh,
but
I think it is.
I agree. Yeah. But I definitely think that they would be right in doing so. And I think that's kind of the point, right? They should, if that actually went down the way you explained it, that is a coup. I mean, think about it, how the absurdity of losing the election and then using political pull to create a situation where then you're demanding things, even though you didn't even win, to then, I mean, that's absurd, as well as the idea of
they had 4 years. If you want to believe the DNC is like, wanted to, that all of this is real and whatever, they have 4 years to figure out how to unseat Trump, and they choose literally the worst candidate ever. The senile, basically Republican, in terms of his policies
Right.
that, created the 94 crime bill and used to work with segregationists like Strom Thurmond, right? And and all of this stuff, and who is super close to Wall Street and has sworn his economic advisors to secrecy about his plans for the economy and all this stuff. This is the guy that the DNC chose, right? And he can't even he probably won't be able to have a debate with Trump. He can hardly talk in public, right?
Right.
And so this is the person that they're putting out there, and now they're making plans for if they lose, because their candidate is so freaking bad, right? That they're gonna basically do all this stuff and just take totally extreme unprecedented actions that would do the very thing this group is claiming to protect against, right?
Exactly.
So it's insane.
Inherent hypocrisy, which I believe is applied to every part of the two-party paradigm today. It's clownishly hypocritical on all of this stuff. And I want to add that one thing you included in your article is, which I found incredibly relevant, and I think, and this to me is the kind of red flag that suggests that this is intentional. Again, this could be a conspiracy theory in and of itself, but it seems like you're driving us into this divide, but that basically Hillary Clinton is one of the people making the claims that she, quote, should not concede under any circumstances. I mean, that's literally saying that we don't care about what you people vote for, which
well, she doesn't.
Exactly. And as well as the fact that this, even more so, guess, and you know this because you wrote it, but guess who, for those watching, played Joe Biden during this whole thing? You want to tell us, Whitney, who played Joe Biden?
Yeah, the person that played Joe Biden in these simulations was John Podesta, who is, former chief of staff to Bill Clinton during his second term, and of course was the former campaign manager for Hillary in 2016.
I mean, aside from the guy being, I would mean personally, in my opinion, disgusting for a lot of reasons, you're picking someone who is openly biased politically, right? So it's just, and he's the one that's, I mean, it's just so clear how this is not meant to be legitimate or,
right. Well, this bipartisan group, right? It's worth pointing out that all the Republican members are part of this Never Trumper faction, or a lot of them are members of the Lincoln Project that you've probably seen on Twitter. That is this Romney Republican, neocon Republican type of organization that's, part of the resistance, like Bill Kristol, who's also part of this Transition Integrity Project, like I said, the PNAC neocons. You also have Michael Chertoff, a Republican, former head of DHS, whose mom was part of Mossad, right? So, an all around good group of guys simulating complete doom for the US. So I really hope people pay attention to this. It's just so crazy, it almost leaves me without words, to be honest, because it's just like, what? But
it's so clear. That's the thing that blows me away. I think you and I were just talking about this. It's so more than as long as I've been doing this, I've never seen something that's so on its face obvious that there's corruption, hypocrisy, illegal activity, and yet it's just because people are so partisan, so divided that they just don't want to see it. And I'll read one of these parts that you added here. You put, also notable is the fact that in the simulation, the TIP, the group we're talking about, blamed Trump, the Trump campaign, for the Democrats' decision to take the provocative, unprecedented actions. So they're even blaming him for doing things that they are claiming is unjust if Trump were to have done it, saying that he created the conditions for them to take this. I mean, again, it's this kind of unhinged perception that no matter what they do, it's just because they've decided. And think about this. It's interesting. That seems like an exact microcosm of the illogical and dishonest projections they put into foreign policy, right? Well, we're murdering people and overthrowing countries, but it's okay because we're good guy and they're bad guy. And that seems like this is the exact same thing. I mean, am I wrong?
We're protecting democracy by destroying it and all that stuff. Yeah, right. I mean, that's basically what their argument is. It's pretty crazy. But going back to Hillary Clinton's statement, right, that you mentioned, not only does she say Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances, she says, I believe Biden will eventually win as long as we drag this out and are as relentless as the other side, right? Which is essentially what, that those policies chosen by Podesta role-playing Biden, right? That's essentially what that is. And of course, Podesta very closely tied to the Clinton family. So It's safe to say that she's aware of what those exercises involved, right? Well, also because a lot of other people tied to the DNC are part of that. Donna Brazile, for example, is also part of the TIP, and you have some other Clinton official or former people connected to Clinton. For example, one of the co-founders of the TIP is this lady named Rosa Brooks, who was an advisor to the Obama-era Pentagon, but also an advisor to the State Department when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and previously advisor to the State Department during the Clinton administration as well. But she's also an interesting character. We can get more into her in a little bit. But it's definitely worth pointing out Clinton saying this very recently. And then, because a lot of these simulations, right, they took place in June. They got some coverage in June and July. But now, all of a sudden, yesterday, when this article I published came out, right, you had a story in the New York Times by David Brooks, I believe, talking about what happens if Trump won't leave office, talking about this group, right? And then you have the Washington Post also saying, what happens if Trump won't leave office? These guys are preparing and they're so great and they're going to protect democracy for us and all this stuff from the evil Trump, it's just that same narrative, but it's worth pointing out too, and we can get more into this later, that I think on the other side, I think at the end of the day, the Republicans, or rather the Trump reelection campaign, is also sort of part of the same narrative, creating election chaos. As I pointed out in my Cyber Reason series, a decent amount of overlap between Cyber Reason and powerful interests that back Trump. From SoftBank, which is Cyber Reason's top investor. They have ties to Kushner. Their head guy was close to Trump during the transition period. Of course, they're involved with Israeli intelligence, Trump, and the Zionist lobby. There's a lot of connections there, right? So I definitely don't think he's, a hero here. If anything, this is sort of helping, sort of ingraining this or entrenching this narrative among Trump supporters that Trump is fighting the deep state, and here is this deep state group, which is true, right? The uniparty simulating how to unseat him. But at the same time, you have the Trump administration sort of playing into this, like with the whole post office thing. These simulations took place in June before that whole controversy erupted about Trump manipulating the post office to stay in power before the election. And then just a few weeks later, he's accused of doing that, right? When he could have easily, he knew these simulations were going on. The Trump administration did, because it's all these like big name guys, right? And it even gets mainstream media coverage. So why would he play into that narrative? It's almost like they're doing it on purpose. And then at the same time, you have Richard Grenell, who was appointed by Trump to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the head of the U.S. intelligence community. He came out a day or two ago saying they're not going to share election security information with Congress or make it public or share it with Democrats, or not, basically just make it opaque and not transparent about it, right? So why would they do that if they're accusing them of saying, oh, they're going to do that? It's like they're playing into it, And I think the end result, as I said earlier, last year, these intelligence agencies that are, and also the Department of Defense, Mark Esper, you had Bill Barr on this joint statement. We're talking about, complete chaos for the 2020 election last November, basically, right? So I definitely think this is something that's being engineered by both sides, and the end result is something, is basically what I've talked about a couple times, that I think they're basically going to try and use whatever crisis is created here to justify a new public form of government. I would argue that democracy in the U.S. is an illusion, essentially, right? And that the real government is something different. But I think the public face of government is going to change, and what the real government is, I would argue, was going to be, more public. And, a lot of these simulations predict some sort of role for the military stepping in, right? Cyber Reason simulations predicted that. So did the Transition Integrity Project, right? And, in the Trump win scenario, for example, at the end of that scenario, they say, well, the role of the military is unclear. It's unclear what they would do in this situation, right? But in a couple of the other ones, they sort of hint that it would be the military stepping in to ensure integrity in the transition process, right? Which I think is really interesting when you consider that, I think a lot of the changes that, the Great Reset and all of that stuff, a lot of those changes that the elite in the U.S. economic and political elite want to see enacted in the US. They know there'll be resistance to that, and they can only use coronavirus as a justification and a disguise for those agendas for so long. So what happens when people get wise to it? Well, if the system of government is different and the military, right, are now the, police, right, it's definitely easier for them to clamp down on any sort of resistance to, these great reset, fourth industrial revolution, AI driven agendas.
Yeah, and you could already see this being played out with the different protests and riots that are happening simultaneously, and it's being, it's being used to set that table. So once they get there, if anything, if we do resist, it's all riots all of a sudden, right? And put it down. That's why people are already floating, and they already had been Trump a long time ago, the Insurrection Act. Right. I think that's going to be pulled right before the election.
That is also in this Transitioning Integrity Project stuff, not in the clear Trump win scenario, but in, I think, 2 of the other ones, because there were 4 in total, and 2 of the other ones, Trump invokes the Insurrection Act.
Of course. They're telling
right
us,
after Election Day. So they're telling you,
Well, I mean, like we said in the beginning, they have been and not just, I mean, they do this. The history is unreal if you want to look into how many times they predicted things there, exercises, but just with 2020. They've been telling us since 2016, over and over and over, this is what's going to happen. Martial law. It's not. Somebody will refuse to leave, or somebody will meddle. Iran, China, this. They've been screaming about this forever. So they're just setting this table. Like you're saying, it's just very clearly set up right now.
Right. It should be clear to a lot of people now, even people that don't normally follow my work or similar work or things like that, that there's this huge push about how the election is going to be a total disaster, even from mainstream media and politicians and all of the stuff. I mean, it should be really clear to people. If you can show the engineered nature and the preparations of this going back months upon months upon months before all of this chaos emerged, just a few months ago and all of that, you have a better chance of success of when those events do take place. People are aware that there were very shady forces involved in the pre-planning of that chaos, right? So, and then if they know that before, they're less likely to be sheep herded into, the places they want people to go. And that is honestly our best chance, I would say.